So I built 3 stools, and in this video I'm going to show you how to build each one. And in the description below I have to my Patreon that has the cut list and the tools required to build each of these. And the reason why I put this all in one video is because I want to show how the skills that you learn from one and then kind of more beginner level allows you to build intermediate and more advanced type furniture. So follow along, maybe learn something new, and build you a cool piece of furniture. The first project is what I call like a saddle chair. This is about as basic of a stool that you will see in Walmart, Amazon, Wayfair, any of those places. The big takeaway for this is that you are learning how to cut compound angles. So this builds furniture in a way that is the beginnings of an aesthetic appeal, but also it's structurally sound. So I chose pine, very simple, but it's 2 tools. Table saw and a miter saw is the bulk of this. Let's go. For the saddle stool, I have chosen to use 2x4 pine. Now you can use yellow pine or you can use hardwood for that matter. And I've chosen pine just to make it cheap, very affordable, make all the mistakes you want, because compound angles is kind of the big premise of chair making. And what I'm doing right here is I'll call the cheap version of milling down lumber and using a table saw to cut off the edges. Now obviously this is dimension lumber. If you're using rough lumber, it's a little bit different. But what I'm doing here is getting it down to its thickness and width, which is the same, so it's a square for the legs. So I got my 4 legs for the chair built here. And what we're gonna learn here is compound angles. So that way the legs can rake and splay. I think that's the right term. And the way that I do that is I can use a miter saw here. And I'm gonna do a 5-degree angle in both directions. So I'm gonna move this angle out to 5, and then I'm gonna put this one back 5 degrees that way. And then you'll cut each end with that same bevel cut. And then you're going to reverse it and then tilt over to get that final leg length. And that will give you the parallel angle in both opposite directions, so it can sit flush like that to the floor, to the seat. So let's do it. Now you can see they have kind of flushed angle at the bottom and then a similar angle that's flush at the top if you put a seat there. Now we'll go back to the table saw to cut a 5-degree bevel on all the top stretchers that attach to the seat. This allows it to have the similar angle as the legs as they splay out and sit flush at the seat. All right, so now that we got a 5-degree bevel on the top, so that's way it can sit flush to the leg as it splays out like this. So you'll have a little bit of an inset that goes into it, and then it'll sit flush to the actual top of the seat. So that's the reason why we did a 5-degree on the top stretchers. And then what we'll do now is we'll actually make a 5-degree for the splay or rake, I don't know what it is, but the outward motion, the 5-degree outward motion of the legs. So it sit flush like that. And I think that's called a rhombus. Now that I have all the legs and stretchers cut, I am dry fitting them to get an idea of what it looks like, and I'm adding a 1/4 inch inset. So the top stretchers sit flush, the bottom one needs to be raised up a little bit so it actually has the same 1/4 inch inset on the legs. For the joinery, I'm choosing pocket holes because super simple and cheap, and it's a great way to just get something together really quick. Pro tip here, or just a little tip, a helpful aspect when you do clamps on an angle, you use the offcuts to put on the piece so they can clamp without sliding around. Back to the table saw, we are going to be building the seats now. Using 2x4s again. I'm cutting the widths or the sides of them off to a certain distance just so I can get my table saw blade in one pass. You don't have to do this. You can actually just flip it over on the other side if the table blade is lower. Now onto the glue up. Just using Type-On 3 here. You don't have to use Type-On 3. It's just what I had on hand. Gluing them up and using clamps. Now that it's been a full day since it was dried, I'm taking it out. Probably gonna do like some light sanding. Don't really care about getting it super smooth. For this right here, it's very beneficial, and you can probably do this even before you join it all up. You can do light sanding on it to break down the edges. And to finalize this, I'm getting it dialed in to sit on the center of each side and then gluing and screwing. Now I know if you're going to kind of factor in wood movement and whatnot, but I don't really care about this, and I don't think that's really going to matter. And then coming from the bottom, I'm just screwing in one screw on each 4 corners, and you now have a completed chair. Next in our project is the bar stool. There's a few things I'm introducing here. One is a new material, hardwood. A little more expensive, but in order to have it furniture ready, you need to mill it. So that you're required you to mill it at a lumber yard, or you use your jointer and planer if you have one. You can do either one. It's up to you. The other piece is I want to introduce the different types of jointer. Specifically, I did half lap for this. And then to do that, I also leveraged more out of an existing tool, which is the table saw. So in this video, you'll see how I milled the lumber, did half lap joinery, but also how I did cuts on the table saw that is using a jig. So let's build. Okay, this furniture piece, the bar stool, we're moving up on in the big boy game here using hardwood. I got a 4/4 inch board there for the seat, and then the rest is 8/4. By the way, 8/4 means 2 inches, 4/4 is 1 inch. I am milling down the 4/4 using the jointer and then planer to get it to the appropriate thickness. But this allows you to do the dimension that you need for whatever glue up we're doing. In this case, we're doing a panel glue up so I can cut the seat. The way that you do the kind of the milling process is that you get the face edge, like one big giant kind of flat side, and then you flip that flat side and go to the edge joint, and then you come back on the planer to do the opposite side of the face, and you now have a, you know, parallel flatness to the piece of material. And then joint the 4th side of each board so I can glue it in the center, and then we'll circle jig it. So we are going to make a perfect circle. Now you can use objects that you already have, like a paint can or something like that, but I want to create a template that I can use for future references because I might make this stool again. And I got some MDF here, 1/4 inch, and I got some leftover just, I don't know, running board here that goes parallel to my runner here to the blade. And what I'm going to do here is measure the distance that I want. So let's say I want a 12-inch round circle. I will do the distance between this blade and that distance divided by 2. So if I want a 12-inch, I would do 6 inches in, and I am just going to hammer that piece in so that we can kind of have a pivot point, and then I'm going to rotate that MDF board around until I get a perfect circle. So let's have a go at it. This is actually a pretty easy process to build a circle. You can use your table saw, you can use existing material. They make special jigs for this. I just use leftover scraps. If you got it, great. But you do need a runner in your table saw. That way you can get it as a parallel to the blade, and then you'll be able to push it back and forth as you make cuts. And you can see that done here. Once you're done, you can kind of sand it, kind of get it nice and smooth, any burn marks left off, and then I will mark it on the seat that we glued up using a jigsaw here. If you got a bandsaw, awesome, you're better than me. And make it as close as possible because you'll be taking a flush trim bit to this. I'm using double-sided tape and that same MDF template, getting as close as possible to the edge, and then taking my pass as I go around, and you can see it has a mirror image of that template. And to make this a little bit smoother, I've chosen to use a round over bit. Your preference, dealer's choice. Either way. For this intermediate stool, obviously you're introducing hardwoods into it, and you want to have a better aesthetic look to the stool. And joinery is one way that we can make choices to make this look good, but also increase the strength over, say, like pocket screws. And what I'm going to be doing is a half flap joint. So very simple. And the premise of this is that we are going to route out the width of my rail here, and then the thickness of this will be how far down I go into that leg. So what you'll see as we go through this, that this will sit flush to the inside of the leg, and you'll have a little bit of an inset when you look at them from the outside. So it'll look really good, very strong, and you won't see any screws. Part of like the intermediate level of furniture making is leveraging your existing tools and expanding on them in a way that allows you to do new types of cuts. Table saw is a great example where it's very diverse in how you can expand the way that you can leverage it. This right here is a crosscut sled, but I've incorporated some clamps here that allows me to do angled cuts. So what I did is just took my little bevel here, made a 5-degree mark in one direction, a 5-degree mark in the other way, so I can quickly change my reference point for my cuts into the material. So that way I can dial in repeated process into each of these legs, because when you stand these legs up, you want that bottom cut to be the exact same as the bottom cut of the opposite leg, so that way they sit flush into that half joint. So this is a great way to achieve a new type of cut, but also incorporate predictability into your furniture making. So let's go do that. Now that we have it all dialed in from the angle perspective, I make my passes at the edges, so where that line starts and where it ends, and then I work my way into the middle. That way I ensure that I have the right kind of fit. She's a real beaut, Clark. Not final product, but you can see the legs, the rake and splay of them. That's all the 5-degree angles. I've gone ahead and glued up the rails or stretchers up there. I haven't done these yet, but I wanted to get to a visual so you can see what it looks like to do all these different half flaps, be precise with your measurements. Just quadruple check, are you cutting on the right side, because that's a lot of cuts. But once you have it done, the strength of it is... So I'm gonna get this glued up, and then once it's done, I'll flush cut those, and then we'll probably do some type of round over and attach the seat. Let's wrap it up. Simple but elegant. Now you can see the half lap joinery looks good. You just flush cut those and you're looking good. The last project is built and designed similar to like a stick chair. And I've chosen this specifically because, one, it looks cool, but it builds off the 2 prior projects with compound angles and knowing how to mill your own lumber. What I'm introducing here is 2 aspects of this. One is building out a new geometric kind of shape of the octagonal legs. I'm tapering them, so I'm introducing a new tool, set of hand tools. And then the second piece is I'm introducing a new joinery method, which is the through mortise and tenon that's going to be wedged. So this stool is going to last well longer than I'll ever live, which is kind of cool, but let's give it a go. So here we have our legs, and what I'm doing here, right now they're square, but I'm using a Forstner bit to actually mark the center of what that tenon will look like. And then I am marking what I'm actually going to mill it down to, or taper it down to, on the tenon side. And then on the bottom side of this, I have my octagon that I'm making from this cut. This is a fairly simple process. You get it to a 45 degree. You get the width of your material, pull up the edge of the reference, and then you'll lower the blade where it's barely pointing out, and then you just keep rotating your material until you have a perfect octagon. This will be the bottom side of it. You can see your squares divide up into thirds. You'll put your tenon side on the front end, and then you're going to get into a lot of good exercise here. So what I'm doing is taking thirds of a pass. So you got the front, the middle, and the back. And then I'm doing kind of a ratio of, like, say 5 in the front, 3 from the middle to the front, and then 1 or 2 from the back to the front. And this allows you to create that kind of tapered angle on the leg. Like that. Now, if that last part wasn't satisfying, this next part really is. So here we are making the tenons. We are using some chisel work here, and I am making about, I think, 3 inches, 2.5, 3 inches, not that long, depending on how thick your seat is and the angles that you use. But what I'm doing here is just using a chisel and removing material until I get to that kind of perfect circle. And you can get it pretty close, but just use a scrap piece of wood, and then you can kind of more or less sand it down with its own material. Moving on to the seat. Now it's done glued up, we are using the same method of the template routing. I made a template earlier for this. I have a nice little radius on the back, and I'm using a template bit, making that first pass, and then coming back with a flush trim bit to be a little bit safe as I take the rest off. This next part's pretty fun, a little nerve-wracking, but what you're doing here is leveraging your sight lines that are drawn on the back of the seat. And I'm using a setup block here at a specific angle so that I can focus on that sight line, and the angle of the block keeps it a perfect compound angle of my intent. You can see those sight lines there, and I'm lining my block up to it. Now, once you get the legs in, you go to the next phase of adding your stretchers. Now, you don't have to add this because the tenons are strong enough to hold, but just to make it a little more aesthetically pleasing, I'm adding in stretchers, and I'm using a 3/4 inch spade bit here. You can use whatever you want, depending on how the thickness of your stretchers are. And I'm using an off scrap piece there to get the exact distance of my internal stretchers as they go across. And one thing to note here is that this is all kind of reference to what you build. I know we have cut lists that's associated to this in the plans in my Patreon, but every time you do a piece of furniture, it all gets relative once you start, because not everything is going to be cut exactly as intended. And this will wrap up my internal stretchers. These are not through tenons, so they're a little bit shorter. Now, very important just to reduce the stress as you do glue up and actually take this apart. Mark all your pieces as they relate to. They are very specific to how it's built and measured, and you don't want to get that mixed up because you may get some wonky legs. Now that these are all taken apart, I'm actually going to cut the wedged aspect in the tenon, just using a Japanese pull saw here. You can use whatever you want. I would probably prefer to use like more Western saw that's a little bit thicker. I think it allows for the wedge to go in a little bit cleaner. Now that we're gluing every joint and bringing it back together, just use a soft mallet to hammer it in. And I'm using wedged tenons here, so this gets it super snug, even along with the glue. And once you're done, you can flush cut those. I'm just using a Japanese saw, but you can use a flush cut trim saw. And then you use a chisel or a block plane to smooth those out once you're done. Once it's all cut off, now it's time to level the legs. Fairly simple process, just put it on a flat surface, draw your line, and then cut. And here you go. Well, folks, you made it to the end. I super appreciate it. This video was a little bit harder than most of mine because one, I did 3 projects. But I knew that third one, that one at the end, was going to be a challenge for me because I'm learning a plethora of new things. And when you do that in a compounded way, they take time. But all that really matters is that you push through it and you learn from it. So if you learned something from this, I greatly appreciate, hit like on the video. That really helps. But if you haven't started one of these projects, go for it. Drop a comment below, like if you're like, hey, I want to start this one or that one. That's awesome. I want to know. Feel free to join the Patreon because that's my best way to kind of keep in contact with you on how, if you have questions or you want to like drill down on something specific. But again, just thank you. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you at the next video.